es la invitación que se le presenta al oyente que escucha a que pueda configurar un escenario propio. Es un género totalmente libre en su construcción.
Radio art is the invitation that we make to the receiver,
the radio listener.
Time to configure space.
Los ingredientes con los que vamos a trabajar son los elementos del lenguaje, música, con efectos, con la voz, la palabra y con el silencio.
There is no rigid diagram or structure that allow us to design radio art. You're listening to the noise of the message.
Para una mejor escucha, recomendamos el uso de auriculares.
That's a very open question.
Yeah.
Extremely.
Come up, I suppose, is that my introduction to music was through playing clarinet. So you can only make a sound for as long as you can exhale. So there is always going to be a gap or a silence. There's no kind of constant sound. And when I moved into electronics, it's the opposite, right? You can just have sound going constantly. And that can be a bit of a trap sometimes, and something that I try to be cautious of is not like to have oversaturation of sound, because I think for me having dynamics and having space is very important. And otherwise your ears get tired, or my ears get tired. But then again, sometimes I guess I do have tracks that just kind of lay a sound and go for a long time. So it's something I do think about a lot, and I think overall it's important to me to have space and to not have just constant sound. I get quite tired listening to stuff that can be just non-stop.
Okay, thank you. How is your experience with noise and silence?
How Okay. It's a very similar question to the last one. What's the difference?
I guess it has to do with the fact that on the one hand, every time Franco asks this question, we've had absolutely different replies. And on the other, dealing with an experience, not necessarily something we're controlling. This has to do with what I'm going to ask after that one, but I'm going to give some background forward in order to sort of spread it out later. It seems that most of our experiences, and considering the particular aspects of your work and what you've mentioned, it seems that there are some experiences mostly on stage and in composition that provide awareness for us of the elements. But there are some experiences, as in daily life or ordinary life, that we're not controlling anything and we don't have that room for things to happen. What happens in those cases? When you're facing a sort of sonic experience or extremely sonic experience plus something which is or noisy or silent, whatever.
So in everyday life, my experience of noise and silence. When I was doing my master's in Canada, I was really interested in the concept of noise and in the kind of strange linguistic definitions between noise, sound, and music. And obviously with electronic sound, you're talking about the noise and the signal and not wanting to have the noise, and the noise is always this bad thing. I think I was really interested in reframing that at the time, and I think noise music has like an incredible potential to take you out of your body in a way and think about the vibratory aspect of sound. And so it can be very powerful, and definitely it's not an easy, and there's no good and bad. It's all different, and noise is so many different things. I also have quite sensitive ears, I suppose. So I enjoy noise music a lot, but I get very annoyed if people don't supply earplugs or if things are too loud in daily life. That can be quite confronting. But then also, when I was in Europe, I loved hearing the sirens, I guess because a lot of European cities have buildings that sound bounces off and are quite compact, and so there was often this experience of just hearing sirens swirling around the city or around wherever you were in the city, which is different from Sydney, which is quite spread out and the population is not as dense. So I enjoy noisy elements sometimes. Obviously, sometimes they're really annoying and difficult to deal with. The fridge in my accommodation at the moment is really loud, and I had a lot of difficulty getting to sleep the other night because it just kind of was going on and on. With silence, I think another interesting aspect actually maybe is that I grew up quite in a city, and so when I initially kind of went to quieter places, maybe on a holiday or to a friend's house who lived in the suburbs or something like that, I found the general quietness quite scary. And we often think about natural locations as being really quiet, but often they're not, or at least in Australia, and I'm sure also perhaps in your homes as well, natural areas can be full of cicadas and noisy birds and can be really some of the noisiest places. Yeah, those are some broad thoughts on noise and silence.
Okay, thank you. As Australia is a big country, it's different when you travel from one point to other point in a small country. Mm-hmm. To me, one of the meaning of silence have correlation with the meaning with the travel. Mm. So to me, each city have their own sound as a person. Mm-hmm. I know people from Sydney and always talk about these kind of things. How to sound your city, especially Australia, especially because it's an interesting continent. What do you think about that? I want your place.
To me, there's a particular bird, the magpie. I know there are magpies in other countries as well, but they're different birds. There's a bird in Australia called a magpie, and it has the most beautiful kind of warble call. And for me, that sound, it gets me in the heart every time. And that's my connection to place and home in that bird. And then there's also the sound of the gum trees and the leaves in the gum trees, which are quite a quiet sound. And gum tree leaves, eucalyptus leaves, I guess they've got a lot of oil, perhaps, but they're kind of shiny in the light. They seem to sparkle when they move in the breeze. And that sound is also very particular. And the casuarina tree, which has these kind of needles, also sounds particular in the wind. So there's lots of sounds, yeah, for sure, about Sydney that are really specific and familiar and just make me feel comfortable, I suppose, and connected and grounded. And what I find interesting is that I find those sounds really difficult to use in my work because to me they're too loaded, or there's too much personal meaning that I can't use them perhaps as objectively as I want to, or it's hard to use them as a sound because they've got so much meaning attached to them, is I guess what I'm saying. And I've been trying to push that a little bit lately because field recording can be a very colonial act as well and quite extractivist, and I'm really conscious of that, and I don't want to just be going to other places and using sounds from other places, because even though those sounds are different to me, they're not different to people that live there, so like everyone has very different relationships to field recording, to sounds, like field recording sounds. It's a slippery slope, or it's a tricky thing to work with in that way, because I want to only ever use sound if I can have a kind of personal relationship to it, in a way. Like I want to really take care of those sounds and not just extract them and collect them, and like I think, there's a kind of icky side to field recording as well. But then obviously if I have too much of a personal relationship to the sound, it's hard to hear it.
Okay, thank you.
That's very interesting. The last section about not being able to hear something because it's so loaded and it's so personal. Concerning these ideas we were dealing with, I'm very interested about your approach to tape, because tape has become a very malleable object, and mostly in this around 30 years or so of digital formats. So it's very interesting with coming back to the format of this, an analog format, and dealing with it again as a sort of autonomous entity. I don't know why this concept has been surrounding the conversation since we started. And I'd like to know about that, because if you're an improviser with your instruments, and you're an improviser with objects, dealing with pre-improvisation in a way as David Toop puts it in his books, or some other late 20th century practices, let's say AMM, or these improvised sections in the work of the ex-Henry Cow members, and where there's a certain logic and certain conceptual conceptual framework or battery that does not necessarily deal with what you're doing in terms of dealing with environment. What attracted you to the environment and this dialogue between the environment and this analog formats? I was thinking about the submerging and burning of tape loops, for example.
Yeah, tape, I guess what initially interested me was that it's material. I mean, even though I work a lot with a computer to both perform and compose, I really have a much better grasp on things when they're physical. And so having sound as a physical medium, and as not only a physical medium, but a thing that you can affect as well, like with the burying and the submerging, it's degrading the tape, which is degrading the material, but then also changing the sound. And I thought that was a really kind of magical connection that you don't get so easily with sound, which is often really intangible, right, and ephemeral. So I think what initially attracted me to tape was the material elements of it, but of course also it's quite cheap to use. When I first got into it, maybe 10 years ago, you could buy tape players really easily. Now they're a bit harder to find, unfortunately. But yeah, I really liked that you could make loops and you could do all these kind of very interesting processes with sound with tape in a very easy way. Yeah.
And following that notion, why tapes and not vinyl records? Why tapes and not music boxes?
Yeah,
And why cassette tapes or not even reel-to-reel tapes?
sure. I think simply because they were available to me and because they're cheap and yeah, you could find them in abundance, whereas vinyl is obviously quite expensive and bulkier, bigger. Like if you're performing with vinyl and you have to carry around, you know, a record player. Same with reel-to-reel players. But I do have a reel-to-reel player now that a friend just gave me earlier this year. So, I mean, that definitely does excite me because it's a bit, I mean, tape, yeah, is also quite, I mean, cassette tape is quite small. So reel-to-reel is nice in that it's bigger and easier to use live in performance. It's less fragile.
And on that aspect, how are you doing with cutting and pasting tape? Because cassette tapes, it seems that they are so fragile, it's more difficult to keep them flowing nicely than reel-to-reel, which is had as a scotch tape for this purposes.
I, again, just like was very DIY. I just used, yeah, sellotape, scotch tape I didn't have any specific tape to join my loops. And I just used scissors. I didn't have like a chopping block or anything. So there's always like a little bit of a sound between the connection. But that didn't matter to me too much. I kind of like the rhythm that you get when you know the loop is going around.
Awesome. Awesome indeed. Because you start allowing the format to intervene with the sound. And the format becomes another member of the band, so to speak.
Yeah, it is very finicky, and I realized that cassette tapes are also very affected by weather. So I was doing a residency in Hong Kong a few years ago, and my cassette tapes my tape loops wouldn't play, which was really stressful because it was too humid, so they just wouldn't move. Yeah, so that is quite a stressful element of the medium.
Yeah, sure. And that's something that mostly happens in our hemisphere. We're so more accustomed to things not working out right and stuff. That's great. Thank you so much.
Well, how is your process to approach to these elements? You have the idea or an inspiration to make a piece and then work on that? And how is your mix?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's often different, but with the two albums that came out in 2022, which were both linked to the ocean, and I guess a lot of my work had been kind of moving towards a focus on the ocean over time. It kind of started as a seed when I lived in Canada because the ocean was a point of connection, like the Pacific Ocean was a point of connection to Sydney, and I liked being by the sea because it made me feel at home. And then I think during COVID, I wasn't allowed to be at the ocean for a while because we were stuck to these particular geographic radiuses, and my home was too far from the ocean, so I wasn't allowed to travel to the sea. And then when that disappeared and we could revisit the ocean, it was I guess it was kind of like a support network for me, where the ocean has always been a connection to home for me, a very important connection to home and belonging. And so it's just kind of infiltrated a lot of my work recently. And I'm also very fascinated by what's in the ocean because it's, as a kind of conceptual point, it's specifically the Pacific Ocean is a huge body of water, and there's a lot of murky political stuff that goes on, and, deep sea mining, and there's a satellite cemetery in the Pacific Ocean where satellites get dumped from space, and all of these things really fascinate me. So yeah, there's the kind of phenomenal side of the ocean that I'm interested in, that's like the connection point for me, and then there's, I guess, the like conceptual side, which is a fascination with political and ecological and narrative elements connecting to the sea as well. So yeah, where did my work start? I think it's really hard to know what came first. Sometimes I think I was just like at the point when those albums came about, I'd started up ocean swimming. So like doing lap swimming basically, but in the ocean. And that became really important to me. So I was just spending a lot of time in the water, and I was approached by Radio Frenia, a festival in Glasgow, to create a piece for their festival, and so wanted to make something more conceptual. So made it kind of about imagining what's in the ocean, what's going on in the ocean, the different layers, the depths. And then the Room 40 release that I did was more, the phenomenal side of my personal connection to what it feels like to be in the ocean. So it can be different, I suppose. I think, perhaps with those works, sorry, I'm kind of rambling a bit, but with those works, the concept came first, but beginning each specific piece, the sound came first. So the concept for the album appeared kind of naturally, but then each track kind of began through working with a different field recording or a different sound that I was interested in.
And do you think in format at the same time? For example, in your process, in your compositional process?
Yeah, I think with the format, often, to be honest, it's been structured by what the opportunity is. So with the Radio Frenia piece, that was kind of a long form piece because it was, initially written as like a 30-minute piece. And then for Mappa, who released it, I reworked it and just split it in half. And I really liked that was a tape release because you've got two halves of a cassette, so it just kind of made sense to me. Whereas the release for Room 40 was shorter tracks, and that was just a digital release. And that kind of makes more sense for streaming and radio play and stuff to have shorter tracks, obviously. And that one seemed more musical to me, for lack of a better word, and the Mappa release seemed a bit more conceptual to me. So having a long-form conceptual piece, I feel like long-form pieces, as much as I kind of want to disregard the streaming kind of system that we're in now, if you want your music to be more accessible, you do have to make it more bite-sized, right? Which is, I don't really want to make music in that way, but I guess sometimes you do think about those things as well.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer.
¿Qué tal?
Very well. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm just in this Airbnb in LA.
You are in LA?
Mm-hmm.
Now?
Yes, yeah.
Can I ask why?
Sure, yeah, of course. Do you know the musician Tashiwada?
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been studying tuning with him, like alternative systems of tuning. So I got some funding to come here and pursue that with him, and I'm playing a few shows as well.
Super.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I am Franco. Hello. Nice to meet
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Gerardo from Santiago de Chile.
Hi.
Alexandra. And that's for this experience you're sharing with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I wonder what's so special about this tuning concept. Is it a particular approach on the phenomenon, or is it working with analog digital instruments? So could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess for me, I work with frequencies rather than pitches, even though my practice kind of started with clarinet and with acoustic instruments. These days I mainly perform with electronics and a lot of oscillators. So when I think about frequencies, or when I think about sound, I'm looking at frequencies. And when I try and relate those frequencies back to Western notation, they often don't fit. Or they're pitches that are outside of the 12 tones that we have in Western notation. So I'm just kind of interested in learning more because I feel like it directly relates to my practice in that way. And also the physics of just intonation and like kind of having, I guess, pure relationships between the notes is also appealing to me.
Thank you so much.
Envíos el mensaje.
What would you sound like? Because listen your works, I have an idea that what you sound like.
Right, I see. What do I think I sound like? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's such a hard question because I'm not objective at all. But I think people often describe, or sometimes describe my work as ambient, and that never feels right for me. Like, I don't think I'm an ambient musician, but for some people, I suppose because there are field recordings and maybe some natural sounds and often, I suppose, drones and layers that might go for a while. But to me, I'm interested in music that's a bit more dynamic. So I find that a funny thing when people say, like, people often categorize you in a particular way that you personally don't relate to. That can be really interesting. But what do I sound like? That's a really, really hard question. I mean, my background is in improvised music, and I think that's a big part of it for me is like exploring alternative technique is how I used to approach the clarinet. And so playing with objects and thinking about the texture of the objects is really important to me as a primary feature Yeah, I'm still not really answering your question, but
Of course, totally. Thank you.
No, you are. You are. It's very difficult to talk about what you do.
Yeah.
Kind of personal terms. It's like when people start talking about themselves in third person singular, which is very difficult. And you start dealing with yourself as a sort of abstraction, which is very difficult when you're embodying this idea itself, so to speak.
yeah.
Il rumore, qual era la, non ricordo più?
Il rumore è il messaggio.
Il rumore è il messaggio.
Il rumore è il messaggio.
Okay, well, yeah, my name's Alexandra Spence and I live in Sydney, in Australia. My practice at the moment is mainly focused on performance and recording using field recordings, objects, and synthesized sounds, electronics, tape, various acoustic instruments. So I'm an experimental musician and sound artist, and sometimes I make installation work as well.
Okay. What are your sonic searches? In this environment that you tell us, what are your sonic searches?
Sonic searches? How do you mean?
What are you looking for when you work in sound or with sound?
Okay. That's a tricky question, or like a very broad question, I guess. It's very intuitive for me. So basically, I'm interested in sound around us, I suppose, is the simplest answer. I'm really curious about resonance and vibration and how sound can animate objects or spaces or landscapes in different ways, and how sound is filtered by space, by tunnels or by different acoustic structures. And the way that I often start a piece, I suppose, is through a field recording. So I often record sounds that interest me. I don't necessarily go out looking for sounds, but when I'm out, sounds find me, or I find things that I'm interested in, and then I might record it and use that to create a piece of music or a composition in some way. But the process is generally quite intuitive, and I don't know where it's going to lead me until I begin, even though later my work does become quite conceptual as well. But I think to begin with, it's a very intuitive process of just an interest in sonic phenomena.
Okay, thank you. This is very, very interesting. We've been coming across people working with sound as such lately. So it is keeping ourselves in this realm. Maybe we're going to insist on the concept of sound as such. And as you mentioned, the concept of vibration as such. In this sense, is there any difference or is there any particular feature that differentiates what you're hearing or what attracts your attention when you're listening to something to music understood as organized sound, and also understood that when we're listening, we're paying attention to certain things and not trying to organize them consciously. When you're listening, thinking in Cajun terms, when you're listening, you're more attentive to what's going on around you instead of trying to make meaning or find meaning or make meaning of something as an a priori statement or standpoint. You just start listening things and you react to what you're listening. How is it that process? Because it's very interesting observing when a musician starts dropping out this responsibility of organizing sound and starts paying more attention to what's sounding around it, him or her or them. And when this composer shares what he, she, they have found, and people listening with them or even react to this as something or a new listening experience or a new experience in aesthetic terms, or it starts questioning the very matter of what's being presented. So that's what I'm wondering, and it's very interesting because it's something that flows out of your work and flows out of what you've done.
I think I actually, when I was studying music, really responded to Varesi's explanation of music as organized sound, and I still think that's what it is for me. Like, I think even if you're outside and you hear a bunch of sounds, I'm organizing it in my mind into something. And I relate to that understanding more than Cage's view that anything is music. I guess, like, Cage has really influenced me as well when I was studying music a long time ago, but I find his concept of anything as sound, as music rather, a little dangerous maybe, because he disregards the social context of the sound, or he disregards the signal within the sound. And if that makes sense, like, I think sound, even though we want to appreciate it for its aesthetic value, it always has some kind of signal within it as well, or social or cultural value or political value that I think you can't remove from the sound. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but...
It does. It has to do with how to cope with meaning in those cases. It always seems that Cages was trying to detach meaning from sounds. He insisted on letting sounds being themselves as a sort of autonomous entity. But in the end, when you realize that it's necessary that a pair of ears or more than a pair of ears make sense of what's going on. It's kind of difficult separating those things. So I concur with you in that. And I've been thinking about that a lot. That's why this was a very, very wonderful opportunity to ask for that.
I guess, just to add to that, I think Cage's understanding of sound is really beautiful, but yes, the meaning of sound is really important for me. So even though I may start with just the textural element of a sound, what the sound stands for also becomes part of the work.
That you have found your sound, or are you still searching?
Good question, because I've been in a kind of state of flux maybe for the last year or so, I think. So I think from maybe 2016 until 2022, I guess my practice in a way kind of began in 2016, like my recorded and performance practice as it is today. And it was growing and solidifying and became a thing I felt really comfortable with and felt like that was my sound up until 2022. And then something has shifted in the last couple of years where maybe it's this kind of natural process of once you feel like you've developed all your tools and all your skills in a particular way, then you suddenly need to change it and you need to push it in a different direction. And that's where I feel I am right now, where something in my practice is shifting, and maybe over the last year I feel like it's become a bit more musical, if that makes sense, or a bit more about pitch relationships and harmony in a way. But I'm not sure where it's going.
It's gonna take up all the space.
If you go further into that aspect, I've been sort of mixing up the concepts and playing with them in a way that I was telling Franco minutes ago that since we're dealing with some concepts that John Cage sort of provided a different approach and a different meaning, it's very interesting and refreshing to be in front of a work and in front of a practice that takes or helps to this new ways of understanding the concepts but differently. Mm-hmm. Everything around John Cage looks church-like. People or hate it or love him or try to do the things want la lettre or something. So I was wondering, since you work with very low mid-volume sounds, which is also an avenue that's been opened by the improv practices, and relating this avenues with some processes that are also taught and are informed by meditation, or understanding meditation as more than as a practice, established practice, just as a state of mind. Mm-hmm. Have your experiences taken you to a place where you start being aware of the primordial sound, as they say, this sound that seems to be the first provider of life. I know it sounds very esoteric. Sometimes it sort of comes up in conversations of this sort and practices of that sort. So that's why I'm asking it, because if you have been facing this primordial sound, or if you have faced, well, mostly when you're performing live, if you have been able to grasp this kind of concepts through your body or through your ears or through a certain feeling or sensation or something.
I'm not sure if I would say that I've got to that place or thought about or reckoned with the primordial sound, but definitely like what you say about meditation I can relate to within performance and especially within improvising. But within any kind of performing, I often I'll find that I've been sitting in a really uncomfortable position, but I've completely lost track of my body. Recently I did a performance in Melbourne and it was really hot. It was like a 38-degree day or something. It was crazy. And when I was performing, I felt totally fine. Like I just kind of completely lost myself in the performance. And as soon as I stopped performing, suddenly I felt really hot and I was dripping in sweat. But during the performance, I hadn't been sweating and I hadn't felt hot. And I guess you just really go into a different headspace or a different kind of focus. It's like I'm there, but I'm not really there in some way. Yeah.
So you would say that that state of flux ends up informing all these practices and all these activities, even considering the ear as the primordial instrument, since we're trying to deal with this concept of primordial sound, and that possibility that makes every one of us musicians. So where does this come or arise when you start dealing with instruments, if you have some practice, as in your case, and the very seductive notion of forgetting what you learned, and the process of forgetting what you've learned. It's very interesting. Have you been exposed to that? Have you felt something of that sort? Were you in the need of forgetting something in order to learn something new?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of stopped playing clarinet, and I'm actually interested to, when I get back home, start practicing again. But I haven't played it for a very long time, and the reason for stopping is, I guess, that when you learn an instrument, your body has a reflex way of playing it. And so it's like I'm not deciding what I'm playing. My fingers are just moving in this way that they've learnt to move previously. And so I'm not necessarily making sounds that I want to make. It's just a habit. And also, of course, instruments like the clarinet, like orchestral instruments, have a very strong lineage and kind of sonic context, I suppose. So when I hear a collection of notes, I tend to hear them, or I think people in general hear them as from an instrument like that as sounding maybe more classical or more jazzy, or you're kind of forming your associations with what you already know from what you're hearing. Whereas with electronics, at least initially, maybe not so much now, but when I first got into it, the sounds were very new to me, and I found that a lot more freeing. And also I mentioned earlier, moving away from thinking about pitches in terms of Western notation and moving into frequencies. I found that really freeing because I wasn't analyzing, this is a minor third or whatever. I was just like, this sounds good. And that was quite liberating for me. But it's funny because I feel like at the moment in LA and kind of learning a bit more about tuning, I've had a bit of a return to thinking about musical harmony and musical language, and I'm kind of enjoying the theory side of it again after some time away.
Sure, that's lovely. That's lovely, getting to be reacquainted with things and rediscovering them. It means that you're alive in the long run.
Yeah.
That's a statement and a proof that you're alive. And vibrating, too.
Yeah.
Okay, what is your appreciation of the current situation of the music industry in relation to the artist, especially our kind, experimental artists? What is based in your experience?
Yeah, I find it difficult in Australia because I guess Australia is so remote that I don't always find the music scene the most exciting for me personally. It can be quite conventional. When I moved to Canada, I found that they had a much more interesting classical music scene, for instance. So kind of much more contemporary approach to new music and classical music, whereas the classical music I hear in Australia is very conventional. And I think that extends into all fields of music within Australia, that it's often quite conventional, and experimental music is kind of lumped in with jazz music. and improvised music, but it's not the same thing, right? And they're quite different things. So I think, yeah, I agree. It's hard to be in such a niche field. It's also really beautiful because I find like connecting with you guys and connecting with other people around the world, it kind of forms connections really easily. Whenever you go somewhere, you meet the few people that are in the scene in that city. And that's a really nice thing, that there's this kind of shared language and community. But yeah, I think, like, I do think about how to make my music more accessible to people sometimes, not in regards to like changing the sound, but in how I present the performance, I suppose, is something that I kind of consciously think about. And that's like when I perform, I often use a lot of objects, and that came about as a way to invite the audience into the performance, where experimental music can be quite alienating for audiences that aren't used to it, hearing sound in a way that's removed from, or it's not quite entertainment, it's not quite music, it's, you know, something that you're not used to. And so I kind of try to actively make my performances more performative by using objects and showing the sound sources that I'm working with, and how these objects can be translated into quite unexpected sound. Yeah, that's something that I've thought a lot about I thought a lot about in the past in my practice, and less so more recently. But yeah, it's definitely difficult, and particularly with the way that the music industry is going now with streaming services and bite-sized tracks, and yeah, all that kind of stuff is hard.
And what do you think that we can do to change that?
I think I think for me, I have to keep reminding myself that I'm not making, as much as I want people to enjoy my music, ultimately I'm making this weird experimental music because I enjoy it and I get a lot of meaning out of it. I'm not doing it for money. So I think it's important to just keep making work with integrity. And if the work has integrity, hopefully other people will see that and appreciate it in some way. But yeah, like I said, I do often think about how we can frame experimental performances to be a bit more accessible, whether that's through talking, addressing the audience at the beginning of the performance or at the end, or some way of inviting people in when they might feel a little uncomfortable in that kind of situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here with us, talking about all these subjects and things, and
we're not getting paid for this program at all.
Yeah.
We're on the same track and dealing with our integrity as our only shield and our only t-shirt, so to speak.
Yeah.
Collect the water in the vessel, move it to another vessel. Wrap something in a fruit jacket. Crinkling of plastic and paper bags.
And thank you for your time. And I don't know if Gerardo have the last question.
No, I don't. I'm also very grateful, and I thank you for all this experience you've shared with us. It's very refreshing because sometimes you start thinking that you're alone and you're the only one doing this or that in that place, and then you realize that that's not true. And on the other hand, it's absolutely valuable and extremely and very stimulant that you have came across this concept by previous experience and a background that you don't usually reach to those experiences at all. So that's very also, as I say, it's also refreshing and it's very stimulating. And it's very stimulating that you're exploring tunings because there's a world of sound between C and C sharp. So
and thank you both. This has been a really, really interesting conversation for me as well.
You're very, very welcome.
Yeah, lovely to meet you both.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's awesome here, and thanks very much for replying our questions and being so patient with the way we start developing them.
Well, good. Thank you for the questions. Yeah. I guess we'll be in touch by email. Okay, bye.
El ruido es el mensaje.
Vamos por más, dice la rana, escúchame, ¿eh? Esto recién empieza.